The title of this is HESI Next Generation Ecological Risk Assessment, which I'm calling a natural evolution of two very successful HESI ecological programs that you all have been involved in over the years. And this is a joint presentation across 4 HESI staff members, myself, Sandrine Deglin, Connie Mitchell, and Rachel Puglisi, who many of you know and have been involved with on calls. So I'll just dive right in of what I'm going to try to cover. We'll start with some introductions, not of everyone on the call, but specifically the HESI staff, for those of you who maybe haven't worked as closely with some as you have others. And then the plan is to really review the ongoing project areas within the 2 existing HESI committees, just to get, again, as I said, everyone on the same page. And this was a request by the steering teams of both committees to really bring the different groups together. There'll be a brief summary and some next steps, and then we do have a Google Forms that Connie put together where we're going to request your input. You can, of course, send additional input via email, but we have a specific list of questions and feedback that we'd like from all of you. And then we'll hopefully have a bit of time for questions at the end. So with that, I'll start with some introductions of the staff. This is us in our non-Zoom element. So wanted to provide some photos of things that we like to do outside of our working from HESI. I know almost all of you. I think I'm Michelle Embry. I'm the Associate Director at HESI, and I've been at HESI for close to 16 years now, and worked with you guys on many of these ecological risk assessment programs, and I also work on the human health side as well. So Sandrine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Sandrine Deglin. I've been working with some of you on the bird and invert bioaccumulation committees. I've been with HESI for 3.5 years. And other than that, I work on other committees that are also on the chemical risk assessment side of things. I think I'm happy to see these 2 committees merge. I think it makes a lot of sense.
And Sandrine is a pro kayaker, by the way, if you hadn't figured that out from the picture. Yeah, I also wanted to mention Sandrine also staffs our UBCB committee, which is an eco-focused project, and also our Transforming Evaluation of Agrochemicals, or our T project, that has eco and human health as part of that too. Thanks, Sandrine. Connie?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. I'm Connie Mitchell. I'm a scientific program manager at HESI. I've been here almost 2 years now, and I work with Michelle on the, since I've been at HESI, I've worked on the Animal Alternatives Project, and I also work on projects related to human health, such as the Botanical Safety Consortium. A little bit about my background. In graduate school, I worked on zebrafish embryos, so a lot of what we do in this committee is pretty close to my heart. So thanks. Happy to be a part of this.
Thanks, Connie. And Rachel?
Hi, yeah, my name is Rachel Puglisi. I started at HESI in 2019 as an intern while I was finishing my practicum for my master's in public health. I was working with Michelle on the Risk 21 committee. And then when I graduated, I kind of just decided to stay around. I still work on the Risk 21 stuff with Michelle and the animal alternative stuff. I also worked in the human health side on cardiac safety as well as ototox, and kind of help around in other areas as well. But yeah, I'm super excited about this merger, and I think it makes a lot of sense.
Thanks, Rachel. And Rachel's been, you'll hear later, very instrumental in helping pull some of the data from the amphibian metamorphosis assay together so that we can do the endocrine work. And that's sort of towards the end of the presentation. All right. So with that, just for those of you maybe who've been only involved on one of these programs, what we've proposed and gotten approval by the HESI board, as well as the steering committees of both projects, and I've talked with many of you about this already, the Bioaccumulation Committee and the Animal Alternatives Committee will be merging into a single program called, at least this is the working title, Next Generation Ecological Risk Assessment. And this is these 2 programs that have been around for quite a while, Bioaccumulation since 2004 and Animal Alternatives since 2008. The mission of both of the groups they're listed there, and what we're going to do today is walk through the ongoing programs. Obviously, both of these have been around for a long time, so I'm not going to spend the probably 10 hours it would take to go through a full history of the Bioaccumulation Committee. But that program has been very, very successful, as has the Animal Alternatives Program. And there's a lot of synergies between the two groups. So that's sort of why we're here today. And if you want any more background information on previous programs that these groups have been involved in, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So the rationale is that both committees, bottom line, are working on what I'll call broadly alternative method development for ecological risk assessment. And that covers in silico approaches, in vitro approaches, modified in vivo approaches, tests on non-protected life stages, et cetera. And that cuts across and has really always been the case for both of the programs. The other part is that bioaccumulation has significantly evolved beyond just B assessment or B criteria, and has focused more on toxicokinetics and some broader risk assessment goals. And that's also, again, part of animal alternatives. There's a relatively small number of companies with resources and people to engage in the ecological work. I think merging these together really provides a nice synergy in that space. And this also cuts across not only companies, but also our public sector members as well. A lot of you have been involved in both programs for years. And, you know, I know that you all said you want more conference calls, but I think really trying to consolidate and identify areas to really, you know, and rather than having 2 calls, having 1 call a month to tackle this makes a lot more sense. The broader remit of the committee will also allow additional participation and synergies and opportunities to expand into other program areas that are important for ecological risk assessment. And then also it helps with HESI staff consolidation. So I've been working on both programs really almost since the beginning, and bringing them into one, and then, as you just heard, have the other staff be engaged with these programs really helps a lot. So just really quickly, and there's Vaganen is off the bottom of your screen. We have probably others. This was taken from our most recent snapshot, but as we're beginning to merge these together, we're increasing. So if your organization's not on here, please let me know. It's kind of a constant refresh to make sure that we've captured everybody. Bottom line is that we have extremely strong government and academic participation on both of the committees. This is a merged list. And from the private sector, these are on the left is the current industry participation. What we will see is an increase due to the merger, and ExxonMobil and Syngenta have already signed on to join. I've also had conversations with Bayer and Corteva, and some of you are on the phone. So hopefully we'll be adding you guys to the list soon. Thanks, Trudy. Ontario Ministry needs to be on the previous list. Appreciate that. If you have other connects for us to follow up with, let me know. The other piece of this is one of the programs, the Endocrine Project, has been a partnership between HESI and NC3Rs. So we've had some companies that are participating on the Endocrine Project only because of that partnership, but we'd of course like to get them plugged in. So BASF is on my list to reach out to as well. But this is something that I think as we take on new program areas, circle back with me, let me know, are there other folks that we need to reach out to get engaged, both from the private and public sectors. So I'll go quickly through our budget snapshot. Bottom line, it's a very healthy budget, because what we were seeing is some drop-offs on some of the programs, increases in interest on others, and merging these together really brings it with quite a healthy budget. So what we're proposing for 2022, and we've gotten approval from, is a single company assessment. So those of you familiar with HESI know that our programs, the industry members who are part of these have to pay an assessment every year that goes to support the programmatic activities as well as the staffing time for these programs. So previously it was pre-COVID, it was $15,000 for animal alternatives and $15,000 for bioaccumulation. We're proposing, we're moving forward with a single assessment of $17,000 per company, and we have 12 companies, so healthy $200,000, over $200,000 coming in. The staffing time we're allocating for 2022 is 50%, and previous it was 55%. We can adjust that depending on the program areas. A lot of the things that you see happening behind the scenes and as well as in front of you is the staff time that it takes to manage all these various programs, keep them moving, keeping them to be productive, scheduling calls, workshops, that sort of thing. So we have enough flexibility to increase the staff time if that's needed and if we have enough staff time to give within HESI. We also, within HESI's programs and our budgets, we do roll over funds from year to year, which is very fortunate, especially in COVID times when we haven't been spending as much funding as we would normally do with face-to-face meetings. So we have a rollover of around 250,000 from 2021. So bottom line is we have around 300,000. So that's basically the number minus the staffing time to use for program work, which is a pretty big number there. And again, that's the result of these two programs merging and the budgets being pushed together. So I think as we begin to come out of the travel ban and we can do some workshops, we also have the ability to do research funding, tool development, literature reviews, and also potentially take on new programmatic areas. We have a healthy budget with really a lot of opportunities to develop some new areas and initiatives. So I can stop and see if there's any questions on that, but I think bottom line is that we're in a great position and we can be, I think, a bit more creative than we have previously to think about what key areas would really benefit from some direct funding. Also, who we might be able to partner with to take that funding, add it on to some maybe other partners and do some really big work in this space to advance ecological risk assessment.
John has his hand physically up.
Go ahead, John.
Sorry, I haven't had a chance to figure out where my raise hand function is here yet.
There isn't one.
In light of the, I guess, new world order of virtual meetings and conferences and things of this nature, and of course, the impending climate issues on the planet, has there been any consideration to, when you talk about future workshops and stuff, adapting sort of a hybrid approach or even virtual workshops, given that we have these realities around us for the next few years and decades?
Absolutely. I think we've talked about that HESI wide, that if we do meetings, we would try to leverage them. And as we've done before, at least partner with other conferences where people are attending. But I believe it's pretty much across the board. All of these would be hybrid at the least. And if we can do it virtually, I think we want to try to do that as much as we can. We also are understanding that people find it very hard to carve out time when you're not traveling somewhere. So trying to be creative and thinking about other ways to do it, where maybe we just have, you know, over a few days, like 2 or 3 hour chunks rather than entire days. But absolutely, that's something to think about, especially I think given that we're an ecological risk assessment project and climate change is definitely something we need to consider. Thanks for that, John. Any other questions on the budget? Okay. The other piece I'll just add to that is if there's other platforms we haven't thought about for things like virtual meetings or better ways to connect. I know we've all tried every single online platform that there is, but if there's something else that comes up, I think we do have the funds to be able to invest in looking into some of those. So that's something to think about as well. What are some of the tools that maybe we could build or use or leverage that would help the broader ecological risk assessment community as well. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So next generation ecological risk assessment. This is really a merger of the two missions of the committees. And I think this is something that we can work to refine as we get moving in 2022 on this. I won't read all of this now, but the idea is to have a focus on alternative non-animal testing methods to refine and communicate the approaches and tools needed to support eco-risk assessment on a global scale as much as we can. So this really gets at tools to evaluate TK, to connect exposure and hazard. We've been very hazard focused in many of our programs. A lot of us are toxicologists, but some of us are exposure scientists. And I think that that's really important. And we've seen that across various programs, human and eco, a very, very big important focus. And then also the second bullet is really just speaking to the fact that we're looking at the broad space. So for screening, prioritization, risk assessment across sectors as well. So this slide has a lot on it, and then what we're gonna do is really walk through these kind of one by one. So I'm not gonna spend a lot of detail, but what we're seeing right now is this merger. On the right-hand side are the current ongoing programs within the Animal Alternatives Committee. On the left are the current ongoing programs within the Bioaccumulation Committee. So I have a bunch of boxes that are gonna pop up, but we're gonna sort of skip those. But this is a nice slide for you to refer to if you want to kind of give a snapshot specifically to maybe management to get approval to be involved in this, or to communicate to other colleagues who might be interested. Really sort of shows that in one slide, all the different programs that we have ongoing within these two merged committees. So I'm going to start with bioaccumulation, and some of you have been involved in this program from the beginning, so you can, go grab another cup of coffee if you need to. This slide we've used a lot. You've probably seen it a lot, but much of the committee work in the early days was focused on the fact that our QSAR models and the traditional KOW-based relationships, they predict bioaccumulation quite well if the compounds are not metabolized. But metabolism, biotransformation, whole body biotransformation is something that was previously really not considered and incorporated into the models. It is incorporated into the newer bee prediction models, so I wanted to highlight that largely because of ongoing work within people that have worked in this space for a very, very long time. Metabolism tends to reduce bioaccumulation, so you have loss of that chemical through biotransformation, as well as, of course, the other elimination pathways as well. And bioaccumulation is really looking at that ratio between uptake and elimination. And the work of the committee early on, as well as other people in the field, had highlighted the fact that metabolism really was the most critical uncertainty in bioaccumulation assessment. So a lot of the program in the recent years has been focused on the idea of how can we better understand biotransformation and use that to help refine our model predictions for bioaccumulation. Now, the committee's done a lot more work in bioaccumulation, so I'm just kind of focusing on this as a snapshot that gets us to those broader discussions on TK. So the method, for those of you on the Animal Alternatives Committee or haven't been involved in this space, is focusing in vitro methods that can give us an idea with extrapolation of that whole body biotransformation rate, and that can be used and incorporated into models. So the concept behind it is we use rainbow trout liver, S9 subcellular fractions, or cryopreserved hepatocytes to look at loss of the parent chemical over time. And this is assuming first order kinetics. So on the red, you have your active material, and the black, you have your inactive material, and you're able to get a measurement of that in vitro intrinsic clearance. Then that is extrapolated to a whole body biotransformation rate. So you're looking at in vivo, going from in vitro to in vivo in the fish, and that can be combined with other elimination and uptake processes to simulate the concentration in the fish and predict your BCF. And that approach and method, this is putting years and years of work into one slide, are two OECD test guidelines, 319A and B. So a lot of the work of the committee recently, over the last 10 plus years, has been focused on this approach. And the recent work has really been taking this, both looking at additional ways that these approaches and methods can be used and applied, as well as the broader space of understanding biotransformation and TK as it relates not only to bioaccumulation, but also more broad applications. All right, so this is a very, very busy slide. Many of you were involved in a large workshop that we had in the fall of 2019 on bioaccumulation and toxicokinetics in fish, and it was specifically focused on the method in fish biotransformation and what the next steps might be. This very colorful schematic down here is the output of that workshop as far as areas for us to focus on. And in my next slide, I'll talk a little bit more of where we've come since that workshop 2 years ago. It's been a little bit slow. It's been difficult to take years and years of work and put it into a single paper that capitulates a lot of what we have been talking about. But a lot of discussion came out of the workshop, with which of course focuses on where are we now and what we've done, but also lots and lots of areas for future exploration. And despite the fact that the paper is not out yet, I wanted to highlight that there's been a lot of ongoing work since that workshop to address some of these areas that aren't necessarily finalized, but are in some cases ahead of the game here. So there's a lot of work, I'll talk about it in a second, on this manuscript that we talked about on the use and application of those test guidelines within a regulatory context. So not what do we need to do in the future, but more of what do we have now? How can we use and apply these approaches? And I'll talk about that in a minute. We also had thrown out there this idea of a consensus paper on extrapolation models, which many of you on the call know that there's a lot of activity in this space, and even to integrate some of the extrapolation model discussion into this first manuscript, it's hard to kind of pull that all together in one space. So even though that paper isn't done, it's something where there's been a lot of discussion, and I think that where we are now is we have a lot already on paper that hopefully we can move that forward soon. What you'll see is there's also been a lot of work that myself and Heike Lauer and I have done on pulling together the lists of chemicals that have been tested in these systems. So we talked at the workshop about coming up with a list that could improve coordination and research, and I think we've actually made quite a bit of progress there. And then along those lines, on the right-hand side, John Arnott's been very involved in some work that ECVAM helped to fund for a fish biotransformation database development, and through his own work within ARC has been pulling together information there. I think that there's, even though the database hasn't been updated, there's been a lot of ongoing work in this space. So even though that was pushed out to 2024, I think there's been a lot of progress. And I know for some of these others in the middle here, there's been ongoing discussions as well. So I just wanted to highlight that as sort of successes that we might not have identified. So related to the fish work, the planned manuscript, this magical, where are we now? How do we use and apply this? I won't lie, it's been a bit difficult and slow. It's a lot of years of work to pull something together into a manuscript that's easily digestible. The desire is really to focus on that direct application and allow it to be something that non-expert audiences can use and apply. As I already alluded to, the extrapolation model discussions are not easy to convey. Been a little bit difficult, but I think we're making a lot of progress. So for those of you who've been very patient on this manuscript and have asked how things are going, progress has been made. We've focused it down, and several of you have, Heike and Kelly Faye in particular, have helped me in trying to focus it to some key principles and aspects. And then I think what we've learned is that a lot of the things that we originally had in this paper need to be pushed into some separate papers. So a lot of the future directions and applications, as well as some of the more detailed nitty-gritty on the extrapolation models, are things that we need to push into second papers. So this is something that you probably haven't seen. Some of you have seen it, but I really took a bit of time to give a high-level overview of where we are with chemicals that have been tested in these two methods, the fish whole body biotransformation. And what this does, you can't see it on the bottom, but this includes the studies from the ECVAM database that John Arnott and colleagues pulled together, plus some new published studies since 2018. And the bottom line here is that we have around 250 unique chemicals that have been tested to look at the loss of parent in these systems across various EcoSAR classes. I didn't go too deep into the classification, but just used EcoSAR. So I think that's really exciting. We don't have rates for all of these, but just to show that we have a lot of chemicals tested. The middle one is showing that we have quite a few where we've tested in both systems, S9 and hepatocytes. And then the far right just kind of shows the numbers of chemicals within various log KOW ranges. So we're going to include this in the paper as just a snapshot to show how much we actually have done within these systems and how many chemicals have been tested. So the last thing, and this is a new figure that I've been working on, so many of you haven't seen this, but a lot of the question that we get is how and where does this method fit? And I think a lot of the work that has been done within the bioaccumulation assessment tool very much plays into this as well. It's a great way to integrate information. But on the left is kind of this most commonly available lines of evidence. And I think what's really important is to put the in vitro assays in context. They fit very closely with some fish biotransformation QSARs that are available and are very, very good. And they go, of course, within the in vitro, in vivo extrapolation to come up with the BCF prediction with the sort of refined model prediction before you would get to an in vivo BCF. But we also have our in silico predictions and basic phys chem properties that all of this is built on. And then, of course, on the right, we have additional lines of evidence that play in for particular chemistries, depending on the data that you have available. So I wanted to make sure to include those as well. And then, of course, on the left, increasing refinement and resource use, and making sure that when we think about these new methods, whether it's for the animal alternatives work or bioaccumulation, that all of that is put into context. Okay, just looking at some of the chat, there's a lot of activity, which is great. So beyond fish, and I'll turn this over to Sandrine in a second, more work is needed. So we've been doing a lot of work on fish for a long time, but we know that there's other species that we care about in the ecological system, and this isn't just for bioaccumulation, it's also general information on TK. So we have our QSARs, our in vitro in models, in vivo and fields, a lot of work been done on fish, but we have interspecies and intertaxa comparisons and additional work that is needed as well. So we have been, since I guess it's been maybe 3 or 4 years, expanding to look not just at fish, but also invertebrates and birds and mammals down here, by the way. It doesn't mean that there isn't work in mammals. There's a lot of work that's been done. There was a recent series of webinars that John and his group presented on some of the work related to mammals. So it's not blank because there's nothing there. It's blank because we haven't been focusing on it within this committee. So I'm going to turn to Sandrine in a minute to talk about the birds and inverts, but just wanted to highlight, why do we look at bioaccumulation? And I think this gets at some of the crux of the committee. So why do we measure it in the first place? What does it tell us, and how is that information used? Or how is it not used? So we have our traditional 305 tests or our BCF estimates, and a lot of times we're looking, is it above or below a criteria value? But what we know is you can get a lot of information out of this bioaccumulation test that inform toxicokinetics, which is those processes and rates, like we saw in that picture of the fish, of absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination. And that information can be used in various contexts beyond just bioaccumulation assessment, of course. We also have various levels of information, both in vitro, in silico, and in vivo. So I think that what we're seeing within this space across both committees is an increased focus and interest in toxicokinetics. And also, yeah, I just thought we are going to share the slides and the recording after the meeting. So just to focus on this a little bit more, many of you might be familiar with the adverse outcome pathway on the right here, but what we know is the exposure, and where TK comes in is right in the middle here, this aggregate exposure pathway, which some of you may have seen. This is just to kind of provide some context of where we're going and some of the thinking here. And this toxicokinetics really gets at the crux of where you see the intersection between the exposure and the AOP. So I think this is something that we really need to think about, and I think this is right where we're playing in the space with the Bioaccumulation Committee. And this is taken from a National Academy of Sciences report, and I'm just going to click really quickly. This is that exposure science, the aggregate exposure pathway, and I think what they did really nicely in this figure is highlight that exposure toxicology interface and where ADME processes and TK come into play here. And down at the bottom here is kind of the methods and exposure science that can be used to help inform this pathway. What I did on this slide is kind of just do a similar parallel type of effort to show how on the AOP side, we have a lot that comes into play here. And if you look at the experimental and computational approaches, much of this is exactly where these two committees are playing. So I just think it's very useful for us to have a high-level overview, not only of the specifics of what we're dealing with at the beginning was how do we, in a weighted evidence approach, evaluate bioaccumulation, but to back up a little bit and think about, as an ecological risk assessor, what are the processes that we need to be looking into, and what are the tools and methods that this committee can help to contribute to. So that's kind of that overview that hopefully gives you a flavor for this movement towards looking at birds, invertebrates, and bioaccumulation and TK. And Sandrine, if you want to just quickly walk through those two programs, I will change the slides for you if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so a quick overview of the bird and invert bioaccumulation data. In fact, it should probably be called biotransformation, bird biotransformation committee and invert biotransformation committee, because that's really what we've been focusing on. So anyway, over the past couple of years, we've been trying to do a literature review of what is known on bioaccumulation, biotransformation in birds and invertebrates. And so first, the bird work. The bird work has been led by Dr. Dave Kuo, who is on the call, I think. Dave has done a pretty extensive review of the bird literature, and he's reviewed over 550 studies addressing both chemical bioaccumulation and biotransformation in bird. And he's compiled over 20,000 data points that are relevant to biotransformation and toxicokinetics in a pretty massive database. We have over 200 columns in that database. And so those data points pertain to over 700 organic compounds for about 500 different species of birds, both wild and domestic. And so currently Dave is working on a manuscript to summarize his work. As a matter of fact, the manuscript has been submitted to RECT, Reviews in Environmental Contamination and Toxicology, and it has been accepted. So Dave has been working on revision, and hopefully the manuscript can be published in the next few months. Next slide.
Nope. There you go.
Thank you. So I've been doing a parallel work on invertebrates, and when I say we, once again, Dave is the mastermind behind all of this. So Dave has been doing a literature review on 10 different species of aquatic invertebrates and compiling bioaccumulation and toxicokinetics data in a similar database as the one is done in birds. At the time, he's got over 6,000 data entries. And according to his preliminary analysis, and Dave, you can also chime in on this, but he's got over 200 entries that are biotransformation kinetic data, that is data on metabolites or parent compounds fractions, and biotransformation rates are available for about 20 to 30 different compounds, and the data seem to be robust enough to figure out metabolism and to back calculate some KMs. Next slide. So the goal of all of this was to kind of know what has been done in terms of biotransformation, bioaccumulation work done in birds and invertebrates, and to establish a state of the science, but also to better understand bioaccumulation and toxicokinetics, both in birds and invertebrates, and figure out if there might be some similarities or differences within species or among species and interspecies, and to explore the potential for extrapolation for toxicokinetics data. So not only among birds or among invertebrates, but also, for example, between invertebrates and fish. And the ultimate goal of this exercise is really to refine the ecological risk assessment practices. So, for example, develop in vitro models, improve in vitro in vivo extrapolation, and also refine food web models. So that's the nutshell summary of what we've been doing with these two committees, if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Sandrine. So I'm going to pause there. I don't want to spend too much time, but if people, again, just note in the chat or raise your hand if Connie's looking at the screen if you have a question or a comment on bioaccumulation before we move to talk about animal alternatives.
Yeah, and I don't know how much time we want to spend, but there were some comments starting with from Sarah saying about more like the fade and transport side, looking at that. Oh, she said persistence assessment and mobility.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering with this merged committee and the title of Next Generation and Ecological Risk Assessment, one benefit is it kind of widens the scope potentially. I don't want the committee to become so big that we're looking in all these different directions, and certainly other groups are working on these, but I'd see it as an opportunity where if there's an area of ecological risk assessment that needs support, it could slip into this group a little easier. And I just wanted to see if that was exactly what you were thinking, Michelle, or if,
Yep.
you know, we're going to kind of see tranches of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be conscientious that we don't want it to get too big, but I do think that often what happens in these groups, whether it's HESI or CTAC or SETAC or whatever, is they become a bit siloed into, well, we work on this and not this. But what we know, and I think all the conversation going on related to other considerations, new chemistries, climate change, we have to look a lot more holistically at ecological risk assessment. So that's exactly what I would love to have programs that, allow us to cut across that AOP, right? Where you have the modeling and you have the modelers talking to the toxicologists, and you really get at the crux of how to look at this.
Pull it all together,
yeah. Again, with the idea that the other part of this, I think, is we don't have to do all this on our own, right? So if there's opportunities for this committee to partner with other groups where we play a supportive role, but they're leading some things, I think that's something to really creatively think about, is how we can partner with other groups. I think that NC3R's collaboration on the endocrine is a really great example of that, but I think there's others out there that we could think about as well too. Okay. The other piece I'll just really quickly mention is a lot of the stuff that, we're talking about with the birds and invertebrates is this, yeah, great, we should try to develop similar models like we've done for the fish. And with almost everything in this space, and you'll see this with the animal alternatives, understanding, well, what do we already have with existing data? What's the state of the science is that first step, which is not always the most exciting work to do. But I think that one of the things that we can provide in this committee is really trying to pull that information together, collaborate with other people working in this space to provide that hub or that home for that information, because all of the new methods and approaches are going to be building off of that. So I'll move on to animal alternatives. And the other thing I'll just mention is all the stuff in the chat, we will capture that. And I think there'll be opportunity for us to put that in the notes, as well as get additional feedback through the survey that I mentioned. So this is all exactly what we want to try to do, is also create a community of practice to talk about where new programs could have an impact. All right, so I will move to give an overview of the animal alternatives programs. The first one I'm going to talk about is the ecological threshold of toxicological concern, and I don't have a ton of time today to go through that, but the concept behind this was based on the human health approach that's been used, was used and applied based on the fact that we had a very robust data set of animal, like rodent NOEL values for a large number of chemistries. And the idea was that for chemicals present in low levels, say it was first used for food contaminants, for contaminants in pharmaceuticals where you had very low exposure, and you didn't have any data, but you had structure. The concept was that could you identify an exposure value that if you were exposed below that value, you would have what they call de minimis risk. So you wouldn't necessarily have to do more toxicology studies. Based on other chemicals in similar classes, you would say that exposure level is not of concern. And what it does is it looks at a probability distribution of those rodent NOEL values with safety factors applied, and the distributions are based on various structural alerts called Kramer classes. Certain classes of chemicals are not able to be included in that approach, but that's the concept behind it. And it's been used and applied, and it's been modified, and there's a lot of ongoing work to look at internal TTCs or inhalation TTCs, et cetera. This was for dietary exposure. The idea, though, and the concept that from the existing data that we already have available, can we use and leverage that? And if you had a chemistry that was in a similar class, but you had no data available, could you use this threshold approach to deprioritize? So it's not a full-blown risk assessment, but it's a prioritization type of approach that could be used. And we wanted to explore that for aquatic risk assessment. And a lot of this was based on the fact that for ecological risk assessment, we don't have a ton of data for many newer chemistries coming in. But how can we leverage the data that we already have to help us develop some models to guide prioritization efforts? So much like everything, it seems like these days, the first step, of course, is to create the database for where that data can live and be used and applied for the chemicals for which we have quite a bit of in vivo data already. That was not an easy task, but what we did is we created a database of, it's around 80,000 curated aquatic toxicity records. Version 2.0 was just released with some additional chemistries included, as well as some additional curation that was performed. All of this lives at that URL right there, EnviroTox database. It's free, it's publicly available, it's really user-friendly, and it's cut off at the bottom, but Ryan Otter at Middle Tennessee State, they built the platform and manage it for us as far as, you know, updates and things like that. So it's been really great. It has a user-friendly interface and includes various tools that are used and needed to come up with these distributions for EcoTTC to help explore the approach. I don't have time to get into all the details today, but it has a lot of it has had a lot of interest, and I think probably even more than the EcoTTC approach is that the database has been quite useful for different applications that we've seen. So this is all of that work in one slide of what we're talking about with an EcoTTC. So on the y-axis, you have your probability, and on the x-axis, you have your predicted no effect concentration, which is the metric that we used for the EcoTTC. And the reason behind that is, unlike human health risk assessment, where we have a concern for one species, for ecological risk assessment, of course, we're looking across taxa, and algae, inverts, and fish are the three representative for aquatic risk. And the predicted no effect concentration is a way to integrate those three trophic levels as well as acute and chronic data. And the way the PNECs work, there's different ways to derive them depending on where you live, but they have different assessment factors applied. So in the case of chemical A up here, so each of these gray dots is an individual chemical. We have 3 acute tests on different taxa and 1 chronic test. And here in this case, the chronic invertebrate NOEC was the most sensitive value. So for chemical A, your predicted no effect concentration is calculated by taking the chronic invertebrate NOEC and dividing it by an assessment factor. The assessment factor is determined based on the amount of data that you have for that chemistry. So for chemical A, it's probably 10, maybe 10 or 100, probably 10. For chemical B, we don't have a whole lot of data. All we have is a single acute algae test. So that algae EC50 is divided by an assessment factor. In this case, it would be an assessment factor of 1,000 to account for the fact that it's very quote unquote data poor. So what the EcoTTC does is it looks at this distribution of the PNECs. And in this case, what you might have is chemistries that were chosen based on, based on chemical classes. Or maybe what you wanted to do is look at all chemicals that had a neurotoxic mode of action and a KOW greater than 3. I'm just making this up. It creates a custom data set for you and allows you to look at the distribution of your PNECs based on the criteria that you as the user identify, based on your context and your problem formulation. And the EcoTTC is that 5th percentile value of the distribution of the predicted no effect concentrations. So that's the idea behind the EcoTTC approach. is that you could identify a chemical space where your unknown chemical might fit and look to see what that lower threshold value would be. So how might we use this? These are just some ideas that the group has been working on since we built this tool and the approach. One, Odd Kinsler was the lead. She is the lead author on a paper on how this could be applied for mixtures. We also have two others that are in progress. One is on the product development side. So you're working on a new product within a company. How might you use this to get an idea of, is this worth moving forward with? Is there something that we need to be concerned about based on other data for chemicals within that class, for example? And then the last one, which is further along, we took a bit of a break to wait for the database update, is criteria value derivation. So for example, aquatic water quality criteria, those are derived for individual chemical by individual chemical. One of the ideas is if you have various chemicals within a class, say all benzenes or all neurotoxicants or all, maybe not neurotoxicants, maybe cyclodienes or pyrethroids, could you come up with water quality criteria based on a grouped approach like EcoTTC rather than individual chemical by chemical? So that paper is trying to look at how that approach might relate to existing criteria value related to level of conservatism, et cetera. So we've had quite a few publications. If you want a recent overview, the one here with Mace Barron as first author was just recently published as a review in a special issue that was focused on the TTC in general, mostly human health. And so what we really tried to do is provide context of how the eco-TTC relates or doesn't relate to the human health approach. So I'd point you to that, and all of these are open access. And again, I will send the slides around. So for this program, this has been a really big focus of this committee for several years now, is beyond the eco-TTC. What we've seen, and I alluded to before, is that the database and the tools have utility beyond eco-TTC. We have this interface, and I encourage all of you guys to go check it out, and the ability to create these custom data sets based on multiple filters, which is pretty unique. We also have created a curated data set of in vivo data. Right now, it's just aquatic species, but it's focusing in on regulatory endpoints. So algae, invertebrate, fish, we have some amphibian data in there, acute and chronic endpoints that are generally used for regulatory decisions. We don't have behavioral data or in vitro data in there. So it's a very specific data set, but we found that it's useful for other applications as well. It also has a calculator for the predicted no effect concentrations based on the schematics and strategies used in Europe and the US, and that's actually very nice that it can do that for you very easily and quickly. And I didn't talk about it, but we've also integrated the existing mode of action, commonly used mode of action classifications, and a consensus mode of action based on the four most common schemes. So VRHAR, TEST, OASIS, and ASTER. We've had ongoing discussions in the committee on refinement of the mode of action classifications for eco risk assessment. There's been quite a bit of work done in Mark Bonnell's group at Environment and Climate Change Canada on this that we're looking into. We're also exploring the use of tissue residue approaches to help with eco risk assessment and using and leveraging the database to help us explore that. And then also some ongoing work has been happening related to PNEC derivation and modifications to that I think will be useful as well. In the future, I think there's a lot of utility for alternative method evaluation. As we know, with these new methods, a lot of times it's a matter of comparing the new method to the existing data that we have. And this is a data set, at least as far as data that are available and commonly used for regulatory applications and eco risk assessment. We've got it there, so it makes it a lot easier to pull data sets that are needed. The platform and the interface that Ryan and his team at MTSU built is really user-friendly, so I think it might be a very useful interface for other data sets. We've had people ask us about terrestrial, about in vitro data, et cetera, so something to think about. And obviously, with any large data set, there's the potential to leverage it for QSAR development, et cetera. All right, So that's EcoTTC. There's a lot more we could talk about, and we are planning to do, we've been saying this for a while, but planning to do a webinar that's specifically almost like a live demo of the tool and database. So be on the lookout for that. But for now, I think Connie, if you're okay to sort of walk us through where we are with the endocrine program. And I know Rachel also has a slide in there about AMA, so we can pivot to her when we get to that slide.
Sure, great. Thanks, Michelle. So yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about what's going on with the endocrine work. So a lot of this was based on a workshop we had in London right before everything shut down in February 2020. And we got together with experts, mostly from North America and Europe, to talk about current challenges with using new approach methodologies for endocrine assessment and gaps with the current in vivo tools, or how to get more information out of the current in vivo tools. So that's summarized there, linked there for Burden et al. 2021, so happy to share that around. But coming out of it were really two groups that have been meeting the last year and a half or so to try and, kind of like Michelle said earlier, get the state of the science so then we can move forward. So next slide. Yeah, and so this is a figure from that workshop paper that just looks at some of the recommendations. So things both in the short term, so increased investment, such as developing the NAMs or validating or comparing the two together, read across and looking at the performance-based criteria, and then longer term to get some, harmonization. So that could be with like concentration setting or dosing or different factors that we need agreed regulatory acceptance on, and then also providing clarity of weight of evidence. So one thing that's really come up, especially with the NAMS group, is that a lot of these tools aren't going to be a one-to-one replacement for the different in vivo tools we have, but figuring out how do we take this as a weight of evidence to move forward in risk assessment. So next slide, Michelle. Yeah, and so this has really come out into these two groups. So there's both, I kind of divided up into the in vivo work and then the NAMS work. So the in vivo work has really, in both trying to look at what tools are already there, so some of them listed there, also looking at some of the historical controls and looking at the test performance. So Rachel has been helping to lead with James Wheeler on the line, one for the AMA that I believe is submitted or close to submission. And then also looking at different historical controls and histopath data for some of those other in vivo assays there. And also at the same time trying to create a sort of state of the science paper with those in vivo tools. And then, for the next part is the new approach methodologies for endocrine assessment. So we're trying with a group with many of the folks that are on the line, we're trying to come up with a state of the science paper that looks at the tools that are already available for endocrine assessment that are in silico, in vitro, or non-protective animals. So we're pretty close to having that together. And what we're really trying to pull together is what else needs to be done, because that will set the stage for what that group will move on. So be it case studies to compare maybe existing data sets of in vitro or other new approach tools to some in vivo tools for specific chemicals to see how they compare, or some validation work. So we're trying to really figure out what our next steps are there. So Rachel, do you want to add to the first part, the in vivo work at all? Yeah.
Yeah, I can go ahead and take it over from here, Connie. Thanks. So yeah, as Connie said, the AMA side of things, we do have two separate papers. The histopath side of things have already been submitted, I believe, to a journal. I don't think it has been accepted yet, but should be in the coming weeks or so. We are still working on the manuscript, examining the historical control database and going over the methods for that and the analysis. It should be getting there. I'm hoping in the next few months that we can have that cleaned up and submitted. We have presented the work at two conferences, both CTAC Europe and Latin America, and have had some really great responses. Adriana said the histo has been accepted, so that's awesome. So here is just kind of a little bit of a rundown over kind of the goals and the reason behind this paper. It will assess the validity and performance of the test design, and to have all of this data in one space really gives us a unique opportunity to kind of assess how well the current assay is working and maybe look into some of these guidelines and see if there's anything that can be changed. I think the next slide, Michelle.
I did actually. I took that one out because it was so much detail. Rachel.
Yep. It was a little small. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we do have some figures that we've got put together examining some analysis stuff that if anyone's interested in, we can definitely share some of those CTAC posters. But that is on the AMA side of things.
Thanks, Rachel. And I just wanted to add, along with the amphibian metamorphosis assay, you know, a lot of the discussions after the workshop in London were focused on the alternative methods, and I have another slide that Connie will walk through in a second. But the point was raised that with any of these new methods, it's always this comparison back to in vivo. And as far as, you know, regulatory acceptance. And for endocrine, we had a really unique opportunity because these methods are relatively new. To go and look and see how well do we understand the performance of those assays from, you know, again, the historical controls. And I think diving into this, and James had already published a paper on some of the fish studies. And so we're really following up on that to provide, again, I keep saying that foundation, but that foundation for how we can then use and interpret and think a little bit about how to integrate the alternative methods into what we're looking at. So appreciate all the work that specifically James and Adriana and Rachel and Scott Lynn has been really instrumental in helping us pull together the amphibian information. So sorry to pop around, Connie, but I think this is, yeah, this is the last endocrine slide. And if you want to kind of just give a little bit of an overview. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this one fits well with both the NAM and the in vivo project. It kind of lays out for the more common modalities, what are the tests and the coverage. And we had a call for this group Monday, so it hasn't been updated, so apologies for that, but just kind of where the different tools can hit. And then also that gives us an idea of coverage. So for some of these, there's not as many tools that can cover those modalities, or maybe they're more on the in vivo side. We need more on the in vitro or in silico side, and those can feed into each other. So this is kind of almost the snapshot of the two groups, but what we're trying to distill out is how we can either refine the tools for the in vivo pieces, maybe include more endpoints, and then for the new approach methodologies, how they can cover or compare compared to the in vivo tools. So I said before, but again, not a one-to-one replacement, but how can we have a battery of assays that could give us both better science and more confidence in the risk assessment?
Thanks,
I think
Connie.
that's about it from me, Michelle. If there's anything else you want to add for that piece.
No, I don't think so. I think this, again, I think that this also is a really great example with this endocrine space. As I already mentioned, this is a joint program between HESI and NC3Rs, and we've kind of divvied up the work and are really working together. And I think it's allowed us to sort of expand our group and work with a lot of other folks. So I really appreciate that. And it's exciting to see. And as we move forward, if there's other partnerships like that that we can leverage, something to keep in mind. And Sarah has a question, and I'm going to pop to that at the very end, because I have one more project. Believe it or not, there's only one more. There's other things happening as well, but effluent assessment, which is something that we had a workshop on a few years ago, which is where this figure on the right is taken from. Within the Animal Alternatives Committee, we've talked about the fact that regulatory requirements really require vertebrate testing for effluent discharge and repeated testing for effluent discharge, depending on the type of discharge and the regulatory jurisdiction. Could happen weekly, monthly, depends. There was an analysis done quite a few years ago now, but it was around 3 to 6 million fish used per year just in the US. And there's a lot of new methods that have been developed. And this workshop that we held back in Paris a few years ago highlighted many of these alternative methods, many of which are listed in this schematic here, which was taken from a project proposal that we had pulled together. And so that workshop international meeting identified various approaches, but we needed to talk a little bit more and back up a bit to connect with the community of stakeholders to understand, I guess the best way to put it is the appetite for these alternative test methods. It's different groups of people and it's different needs. And so one of the things that came out from the meeting was the fact that there's a lot of research that can still be done. We could really help to identify some research proposals and programs to advance some of the methods. But concurrently, we really needed to have conversations with the people who perform these tests, who require these tests, and who evaluate the data. So the current status is that we had gotten a group together, and on the bottom left here is the paper that came out of that workshop, the international workshop. We got a group of people together that were very interested in discussing this issue within North America, and a lot of that was related to the fact that we have quite, I guess, bottom line is the effluent testing requirements are very, very different in North America than other places in the globe. So what we decided to do is really focus in on what's that appetite for acceptance and implementation of alternative methods within North America. So looking at Canada and the US, we planned, and it's like a really amazing workshop agenda with speakers and everything that we planned. We were going to hold it. Trudy had hooked us up, and we were going to have a meeting in Toronto at the Ontario Ministry pre-COVID. We've postponed it, and we were going to try to do it virtually, but decided that given the groups of people that we'd be wanting to reach, it would be very difficult to do that. We've had a lot of progress in connecting with Trudy's help, specifically within Canada, at the federal and provincial level on various topics related to data availability, information, data needs, database development, things like that. And this also very much links into some of the initial work of the CTEC Aquatic Toxicology Interest Group. So it's taken us a little bit. We were planning to hopefully do some webinar training courses. And then again, once we can have an in-person, it's relatively small in-person meeting, circle back to that workshop proposal. But there's a lot of interest and a lot of opportunities, even beyond just the alternative method use and application, but better understanding and connection and leveraging data from the effluent tests that are performed, but the data are not always available in a way that can be accessed. I think a lot of the discussions we were having, even just within Canada with the different provincial representatives, has been very, very valuable. So we'll be picking that up again. And if there's folks on this call who'd be interested in being involved, please let me know. Okay, so this is that giant slide again. So if you need to orient yourself, this is kind of what's currently ongoing. So this is like the current state of where we are, but this isn't everything. The committee always has been very involved in CTAC, specifically with the interest groups on bioaccumulation and animal alternatives. We've been very involved in session chairing and presenting and contributing. We are going to be involved, and Mark Leonard is on the phone, on a special science symposium on animal alternatives, a CTEC Europe symposium that I think is going to be virtual, but maybe be hybrid, we'll see. And then we've also, as we just heard about with NC3R, has been involved in other workshops, et cetera. We're also involved in various Suffolk LRI research programs. One that I didn't cover today that we're part of is the SWIFT program, which is a Bayesian network for fish acute tox, which also leverages a lot of the initial work on fish embryo testing, and also various bioaccumulation and animal alternative cell line assays programs that Suffolk LRI has funded over the years. Not only CTEC, but we present our work at international conferences, virtually and in person if we can. And we're very keen to expand our outreach in other areas of the globe. And we've had a lot of recent outreach in South America. And Sarah had asked, there's a new initiative within HESI that we're calling GROTC, which is a Global Risk Assessment Training Center. The concept there is for less resourced and lower middle income regions of the globe to try to create opportunities to provide training courses, basic risk assessment training courses, or, depending on the needs of the particular areas, partner with other groups. I know CTEC has done some of this to provide those basic outreach and training activities in this space. That doesn't always happen through our general channels. And so that's something that I would love for this committee to be involved in as that expands and begins to develop a bit more. Right now, we're focusing in on Southeast Asia. We have a partnership with the Chulaborn Institute in Thailand. We have a HESI board member who's in Ghana, and she's helping us to make some connections within West Africa, particularly in the English-speaking regions as a start. And then we also have quite a few connections within Latin America. A colleague who's at the University of Buenos Aires has been very instrumental in connecting us there. And also we've had quite a bit of outreach in Colombia recently and in Brazil. So if you're interested in talking with me more about that, please connect with me and let me know, because it's just getting started and it would be great to bring in quite a bit of eco risk to that as well. So in summary, we've got lots of projects you can get engaged in. And if it's something that you used to be involved, but you haven't had a lot of time, or you have a new area that you heard about today that you'd like to get involved in, please let us know. There's also leadership opportunities. And with this merger, we're using this as a chance to kind of develop a combined steering committee, as well as really identify some sub-project co-chairs for each of these projects. So really great opportunities, especially if you're really interested in helping to lead one of these programs. If you have colleagues or other connects who you think would be great to get involved in the programs, please let us know as well. We also would like to do more regular webinars. We have had a few series, but across the two committees, there's so many topics to cover that we can't even, begin to scratch the surface. If you next week see a CTEC presentation and you would like to learn more, we can have an hour-long webinar, whereas CTEC is a 12-minute presentation. So please let us know. It would be great to have a regular, maybe not monthly, maybe every other month webinar within this new merged committee that can highlight various work. And again, as we already talked about, new project areas that we can explore. We have a lot of flexibility and other ways to integrate the existing efforts together. Please suggest those. And we have a survey. I will send the link around probably multiple times. And we're asking on the survey which working groups you'd want to be a part of, if you're willing to serve in a leadership role for any of them, or as a leader, as a person on the steering team. We have a please list any other projects. You can list them in the survey. You can also send us emails too, that's fine as well. And then we also are asking if there's other organizations or people that we want to reach out to get involved, whether they want to be committee members, whether they're groups that we would want to leverage and partner with for future activities, etc. So next steps. I think what we would like is to get survey input by December 15th. That way we can pull it all together and then early in 2022 really kind of coalesce everything and organize and hit the ground running in January 2022. If you need more information or have questions or want to talk about project ideas, please do not hesitate to let me know. We will be getting a new SharePoint pulled together. That's a big lift that we have to do as staff. But that's something that we want to do to kind of merge these together, do a refresh, have an archive for the old stuff, and make it very easy for everyone to navigate. There's ongoing calls for some of these groups happening and papers being worked on. If you're not already involved, but you want to get plugged in before kind of that, January, New Year, let's get started, and you want to be on a call that's happening between now and the end of the year, or you want to get updated on something, just contact us directly. Whew, so there we have some time, about 15 minutes. I appreciate those of you who are able to hang on for the full hour and a half. We can answer any questions, take suggestions for project ideas. There's been a lot going on in the chat that I will try to capture as well. But I'd also like to see Connie, Sandrine, or Rachel, anything else you wanted to add?
Nothing specific for me, just, really excited for all this work and to see it move forward and how we can integrate the different pieces together.
Yeah.
Yeah, nothing either from my end. Thanks, Michelle. I think you covered it very well.
Yep, nothing else for me either.
Okay. I see a comment from Heike with a point about the new approach methodologies for chronic fish. We actually had a workshop in 2010, I believe, on the fish early life stage, the OECD 210 and alternatives for that. We were focusing, and I don't know if Mark Leonard is still on the phone, but we had that meeting, and there was a lot of discussion there, but that was quite a few years ago now. And so I think that looking at where we are related to the chronic endpoints and how we might kind of almost do like a reset and evaluate that is definitely something to look into. Obviously, chronic effects are really kind of where the rubber meets the road and where we really need to explore further. And there's a lot more that's been done in the AOP space that I think could be leveraged there as well. So that's a really good point, Heike. And Hans's point about the WHO Chemical Risk Assessment Network, I'll be in touch with you, Hans, because we used to be involved in that, but we aren't anymore. And that's one of the things I've been trying to get a handle on, of what that group is doing and how we can leverage some of these needs within these other regions of the globe. And I think that's something to think about within this group as well, is that we're very, centered on certain regions of the world, and to think a little bit about how some of the needs might be different and how we can reach out and make sure that we get broad perspectives in the projects that we're working on. I think that's going to be very important as we go forward.
Michelle, one thing that Wendy had said earlier that kind of thought about again was microplastics, and that's come up a few times. But maybe Sandrine could, because she's on the UVCBs, maybe how that could fit in. Sorry to put you on the spot, Sandrine, but thoughts on that?
Yes, no problem, Connie. So yeah, microplastic is not something that we have really integrated into the UVCB issues right now. I mean, it looks like it's a big issue currently. There's been no real desire, from what I've seen, on the part of the group to start dealing with it. So I'm not sure where that would fit in currently, really.
There's a lot on polymers too. I mean, I think that, yeah, that is something that I think it's ongoing, and I think that as folks on this group who might be involved in those discussions, to provide your input on what's ongoing in that space and where it could fit or maybe doesn't fit or maybe is handled in other areas. I think that's something to, to think a little bit about the domain. So one thing, for example, bioaccumulation, from the beginning, we've been focusing on organics only. We're not dealing with metals, and that was a decision made by the group. So same idea there. I think as these, they're not new, but as these other chemistries come in, evaluating kind of, is this something the group should take on? Is this something other groups are working on, et cetera?
Right. Yeah, and for the UVCB, it's the same thing. So from the get-go, we said, okay, let's focus on organics. Now we're trying to develop a risk assessment framework, and I think we're talking about applicability domains and these kind of issues. And I think once we come up with the framework, we can always say, well, would microplastic fit in here? But yeah, it's not necessarily the focus of this project, or a focus.
Exactly. And I kind of meant it more in a keep on our radar. How would it fit in versus a whole project forward, but leverage what we have done already.
Yeah,
and it's coming up. I mean, I think it's on the kind of front and center for many people right now, as well as polymer. So we sort of keep it in mind.
Yeah, and I saw Mark. Glad you agree, Mark, because I feel like it's been a while since we talked about the chronic fish more specifically, although it comes in, of course, with the discussions on endocrine and things like that. So I like that idea. The other thing I wanted to mention, I'm just looking at who's on the phone now, is that we are a really unique group because we have various sectors involved. You know, we have people who have experience in chemical sector, the ag chem sector, pharmaceutical sector, personal care, cosmetics, petrochemicals, probably missed some. And I think that identifying not only where we can all work together, but also are there sector specific, you know, things. I think one of the things we've seen is some of the ag chem guys are joining in on this, which is great to see. And that's a different case, right, where you have a lot of animal data. And you have the ability in some ways to leverage that information in a way that you might not have for some of the other sectors that are more data poor. And I think right now we just have Sanofi with Peter from the pharmaceutical sector, but we had Pfizer and Lisa Constantine involved previously. That's also something to kind of think about. Are there programs or ways that we can leverage, whether it's sector specific questions, or we can leverage one sector, you know, we can steal from the rich and give to the poor, so to speak, on the chemical data side of things. So just some things to kind of keep in mind as we go forward. Any other comments or questions or things that keep you up at night from a chemical risk assessment perspective that you want to bring up? I see Trudy's point about understanding the affluent regulatory context in other regions of the globe. We covered some of that at the workshop, but what we learned is it's very, very patchwork and different. So I think maybe even looking at that a little bit more specifically, particularly in areas that we didn't cover at that workshop, would be great.
Yeah, and just one thing real quick, someone told me they had issue getting the link in the chat. And so happy to send that around. And also it was just the questions that were on Michelle's slide. So maybe if you can't access it, you could just answer via email too.
Yeah, I'm going to send around after the call. I will, you know, we'll send around the slides. We'll send around the link. We'll send around the link to the recording, things like that. So there'll be multiple emails from me with a link to the survey. Don't worry. So, well, if there's nothing else, I'm happy to give you guys 8 minutes of your day back. But I really appreciate everybody's interest, participation over the years. Many of you have been involved since the very, very beginning. So I'm excited to keep working with you. I appreciate all the time and effort that you put in. This is a volunteer effort, and I really look forward to the next phase of this work.
Did anyone who come on camera have questions?
Everyone wants to just wave and show their face.
Take care, everybody.
All right, thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
I
Take
should
care.
make a video of that. That was pretty cool to see all the waves.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Wow, thank you.